Good morning. I'm going to talk to you this morning about millennials and contact center. I thought Brian's presentation was great because there are some superpowers that millennials do have that we're going to talk about. As we get started, though, I want to talk a little about the working generations. Brian talks about the accidental narcissist. I love that term, and I'm going to freely make sure he knows that I'm going to borrow it in the future because I do think we have created that. As I was researching the topic, though, I will tell you that there were some things that jumped out at me about what we're calling the working generations. These are generations that still have people in the workplace or in the workforce. Even the silent generation, or what we might know as the maturists at the very bottom, right, are the generation of our mothers, our parents, and our grandparents. There is differences between the generations, and there are some gaps that we're looking to bridge. But they're absolutely being driven to be this accidental narcissist. The three things that jumped out at me were around how people communicated with each other, what they expected, what products define their generation, and how they define technology. So the silent generation, or the maturists, they were defined by automobiles. They like face-to-face generation, and they tend to be what we call disengaged from technology, right? Until you talk to my mother and her use of Facebook, which in this case is becoming, did you see what your brother posted? And why wasn't I not invited to that thing, right? So that's creating the drama in the family now, social media is. We have baby boomers. They're defined by televisions. That's a product that defined them. They still like face-to-face and telephone conversations, and they communicate. Again, that face-to-face, that telephone, they like to communicate via that mode. And some of the readings that I saw called them IT adapters, right, from a technology perspective. Then you have Generation X. Those are those folks that we're calling them digital immigrants. Because they migrate towards new technology like moths to flame. I can say that, I've adopted things like Snapchat, certainly Facebook is passé, Instagram, we're using all kinds of different communication modes in my own home where we text each other from one room to another. They like to communicate via text. I can attest that I am a big texter. We're defined by personal computing. As our product that defined our generation. And Generation Z, really, these are what they're calling, really, anyone in here who has any teenagers would appreciate that they're called the technoholics, right? Because they have to have technology. They're defined by products like Google Glass, 3D printing, nanobots. They've grown up in this age of technology. Much like millennials, who, that's what they didn't. Nobody who's a millennial did not grow up with the internet, right? And the interesting part to me is that when how Generation Z's, right, likes to communicate is via FaceTime. They're going back to that face-to-face communication, where I receive FaceTime calls from my daughter at all points. She does not understand that this is an audio-only device as well. Doesn't want to know, doesn't want to use it that way, can barely even answer the phone when you're calling her. So we're going to talk about Generation Y and delve a little bit more into millennials and who they are, because they are actually a very large percentage of our workforce in our enterprises, at least 40%, higher in some areas, and you'll see an interesting stat on what they make up from a demographic perspective at Convergys. They are the most influential next to baby boomers. And the reason for that is how many there are in the present workforce, right? These are people that are at least 24 years old or 22 on up, depending on when you see the breakdown of the birth years. They're very technology driven, no big surprise. They're highly social, and that doesn't mean they're friendly. What that means is they're socially engaged in a lot of different channels. Right? The majority of users, or a big percentage of users of Twitter, are millennials. They are entrepreneurial. By 2025, they'll represent 75% of all workers in the US and across the globe. A couple of little interesting tidbits on them. Only about 20% have mortgages. Only 16% say a bank branch is important. And I thought that was great because Brian made a great point, right? they're using apps. I mean, it was just a few minutes, but probably about a year ago, that my mom finally figured out how to use online banking to pay her bills. So they don't need branches. Nobody does. But branches are seen as passé. But I remember certainly as my parents feeling that they needed to conduct business at the branch, even going to make a deposit at the branch. And think about that today, we just take a picture of a check and away it goes. Only 11% have stocks or mutual funds from a savings perspective. And only about 10%, even though they're so entrepreneurial, only have about a business account. They also drive increasing expectations. So the concept of accidental narcissist is absolutely true, but even more so for them because they are full-on narcissists. Because you'll hear them also defined as the me generation. They expect service anywhere, anytime, because we are driving not only them but Generation X, the other demographics that I was touching on, as accidental narcissists. They always want to be connected. They're mobile. They expect things to be immediate, right? And they're all socially engaged. And they really have high expectations of service. So they have high expectations of the customer experience that I'm going to get through channels. But then if something does fall out, I have a high expectation of the service I'm going to be getting and receiving. This is driving a changing world in contact centers. Because while there's lots of research that says phones are dead, speech is dead, voice is dead, that's actually not true. We are seeing at Convergys, a very large volume of voice calls that we're still getting, but the mix is changing of those voice calls, and I'll give you more details in a moment. So interestingly, 46% of people will use self-service channels. You see that graphic at the bottom. And that number will even go up, right? If a transaction it's deemed by them to appear to be easy. What's my balance? Where do I send a payment? But when it gets hard, that percentage drops. And not only millennials, but anyone in a service environment or any one of us will look to agent-assisted channels as well as voice interactions, direct telephone interactions with a call center as a way to get those difficult transactions serviced. So people prefer to handle things on their own up until the going gets tough. We're still seeing that telephone agents are still top choice for hard issues. When you see what we define as easy versus hard, Convergys does a huge research study every year, and we actually go out to our clients, and do this really big survey where we're asking clients that only have interactions that within the last 6 months, right? So that we're getting a pretty fresh snapshot of the consumer trends and behaviors. And the channel most often used from an easy perspective is chat. Chat has gotten better. People have figured out how to staff it. The latency is better. They're not putting 10 chats per agent anymore, right? You're getting a response time on there. And people have gotten better about managing, and they will adopt it. But for things that we're deeming hard, for whatever reason, all these calls become complex at some point. The customer effort tips over, right? A customer effort, which is individual and can be individual by generation, how each generation will define what makes it hard, or the patience that they may have for an interaction. They tip over at some point, and they are then looking to either jump a channel to see if I can get service in another channel, or I'm just trying to zero out, or just get service with a customer. With an actual call center, with an actual live body. And let me tell you something. If I'm traveling in India and I have been on a 2-week business trip and all of a sudden my business card quits working, the last thing that I want to interact with is a self-service channel. I don't care what your chatbot, I don't care about your virtual assistant. All I know is that I want my credit card to start working immediately, right? And so how do I get that service as quickly as possible? So that's what, so those are the frameworks that we are looking at when we're looking at service. So you're looking at, as millennials, as a large portion of people we have to service, and then you have to think about what happens on the other end of that, which is that the transactions are harder, right? We are seeing rise in assisted service, absolutely. We're seeing where we have more chat agents are needed. chat agents that can do two-way SMS, for instance, and handle SMS interactions. Those are needed. But then there's always a point when there may be an escalation. And that escalation often happens, again, when the customer effort is exceeded. And then what tends to happen is you have all of these very difficult transactions now entering into a contact center that is probably still very traditionally managed, but is comprised of a large portion of millennial agents. But they're maybe not paid as great, right? They may have the same business model, and a lot of enterprises that I've seen, they have the same business model that they had 15 years ago, right? But the calls are more complex. We actually require a different skill set of agents when they're servicing these more complex calls. We need them to be problem solvers. We need them to be technically adept. We need them to be smarter about how to handle an interaction, be more empathetic. And sometimes that is driving the divide between service, agent-assisted service, and then what you're expecting from agents themselves and what customers are expecting from the service that they're supposed to be getting. Remember that other slide I showed you, and what Brian was talking about was around what we expect. We have been driven and trained to expect everything to be immediate. But oftentimes it doesn't. It's not. Millennials are changing us. They're changing Convergys for sure. So this is that stat I wanted to share with you. 81% of our workforce are millennials. That's who makes up our agents, right? Our workforce. We've done a lot. There have been a lot of studies that we've done from a Convergys perspective, and certainly Forrester, Gartner, all of the very big analysts, prestigious analyst firms, Opus, go out there and they do research around customer experience and what customers expect. There's always that outside-in view. We've started doing a lot of research about the inside-out view from an agent perspective. What do we need to provide agents and hire agents that have different attitudes about work and technology, that has that digital fluency in social media, right? They want that sense of belonging. You have to, as we want to provide a superior experience, designed for a superior experience, on the other end of that, you have to know that not every single transaction is going to be we want them to be self-service. Customers want them to be self-service. I want to serve myself, but in some cases, I may not be able to. So we have to look at how do we shift the mindset from designing for customer experience, both externally, but also internally. So this rise of the millennial workforce, it's forcing everyone here, if anyone works in a contact center today, to adapt to that changing landscape, right? Both for clients and the people that service those clients. We all have increased pressures to perform from both customers and employers. Part of this is solving the attrition question that comes up. So we always talk about customer attrition or customer experience or the bad customer experiences that drive NPS scores externally. Well, there's also a net promoter score that's internal in contact centers, right? And that is often driven by our attrition rates. There are contact centers that I've been in who have 100% attrition rate, right? It's two dirty words that are out there, but that do exist in our industries. We have to be able to solve the puzzle of how you keep people and now how to keep millennials engaged, because you're going to have to solve the puzzle around serving more complex transactions. You need a different skill set of agent. You have to pay them more. We have to train them better. They have to have a deeper level of understanding. They have to have problem-solving skill sets in order to provide the promise of that designed customer experience that we want to get to. So we look a lot around attracting, motivating, retaining. So as much as it's designing that customer experience, it's around designing agent experience, providing those tools. How do you go out and get these, how do you go out and attract the right agents, right, with the right superpowers? How do you attract millennials to want to stay? How do you motivate them? How do you retain them? How do you drive down your attrition problem? Because really, even if you just drove down your attrition rates by 3%, the impact would be significant. Just think about and do those numbers in your own head based on what you know are your attrition rates in your centers. I'm sure there's no attrition. Don't get me wrong. I'm not pointing fingers, just like we don't have any. But if it did exist, there is a puzzle there to solve. Why millennials? What are their superpower, right? We talk about them as consumers. Well, think about this. There are 2.4 billion people already out there in the world that are under the age of 30. 40% of today's workforce in your companies are probably millennials. Or higher, like us, we're in the 81% range in our enterprise. Within the next 10 years, they're going to make up 75% of the workforce. They are the biggest impact from the perspective of generational workers. So it is a big fix for us to we can all talk about customer experience, and it's so great to design all these experiences and put out all these great new self-service technologies and design for improved experiences and better net promoter scores. But it's key to solve the issue of how to service this generation within our own enterprises so that they actually provide that elevated experience when somebody does happen to fall out of one of those extremely well-designed channels. So handling complex interactions of today and in the future, right? Really the three big takeaways that I have for you and the ones that we internally are focusing on is understanding and engaging. We've done a lot of analysis around our own demographics of our agents, what keeps them happy, how do you recruit them differently? Because you have to. How do you keep them, right? How do you leverage digital tools? So as we talk about all these great tools that we provide our clients, how do we take those and make those internal facing so that we can machine enable these agents to be more efficient and more effective? Things like RPA, internal type of chatbots, knowledge management systems. How do you provide them with that omni-channel journey information that clients have as they're, again, navigating all these great digital channels before they may go into an agent-assisted or a voice interaction? And we have to really look at redefining the skills and capabilities needed for more complex and difficult work. Because the calls that are going into our centers today, and you probably know this yourselves in your own centers, in your own experiences, they're longer, they're harder, right? Because we're taking care of all the easy stuff. They're transactional in nature, transactional type calls. We don't really get much of those anymore. People have learned to use their transactional chatbots. Their self-service applications. They've learned how to do this. What we're getting is all the hard stuff. So how do we make a difference with that? So with that, I'll leave you. Thank you for giving me your time. Visit us in our booth. We're in number 301 in the exhibit hall, and we look forward to seeing you.